Welcome everybody to Maine's Moose. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Welcome everybody to Maine's Moose. We're going to be getting started now. We're going to go down to Jade, who is out by the moose at the Maine Wildlife Park in Gray.
Hello, welcome everyone. I am Jade and I am an educator for the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And today I'm at the Maine Wildlife Park in Gray, Maine. Here at the Wildlife Park, we have many different species of native Maine animals. We have moose and bear, different cats like bobcats and the Canada lynx, owls, different reptiles, and many more. And all the animals that are here because they can no longer live in the wild. So some of them are orphaned or injured. Some of them are even human dependent or were illegal pets. So all different number of reasons that they can no longer live in the wild and live here at the wildlife park. And if you want to learn more about the wildlife park and the different animals that we have here, you can visit mainewildlifepark.com. Here I'm outside of our moose enclosure at the wildlife park. And you can see behind me, this is the bull moose. That is what we call the male moose. They're called bulls. And we have a cow as well, and cows are the female moose. But just the bull is here behind me. We'll see if later on the cow is feeling friendly and wants to come say hi also. So moose are one of the most iconic animals in Maine. They are one of the top animals that residents and visitors come to Maine to see. And they are the largest land animal in Maine. And they are the largest species of deer. So moose are actually a species of deer, also called cervids. The only two species we have in Maine are the white-tailed deer and the moose. Those are our two deer species. And another name for this family, as I said, is the cervids. And they are the size of these cervids is one of the reasons that people are so attracted to moose. They can be between 850 and over 1,100 pounds for a full-grown bull moose. And the females, the cows, are a little bit smaller. They'll be between 600 and 800 pounds. And when they're newborns, the calves only weigh about 25 pounds when they're born, but they grow really fast. They can gain over 2 pounds every day while they're nursing. So they grow up really quickly. And if weight isn't enough, we can also talk about their height. So moose are usually tallest at their shoulder, especially when they carry their head kind of even. And at his shoulder, he is about 7 feet tall. They can be anywhere from between like 6 and 7 feet tall. And I'm about 5.5 feet tall. So that means at his shoulder, he's over 1.5 feet taller than me. And like I said, we have 2 moose here at the wildlife park. We have a female, a cow, and we also have a bull. And they were both orphaned, and they were brought in needing milk. And moose milk is very, very rich. It's very high in fat. So all the moose here at the park have been orphans. They're all non-releasable due to their captive diet varying very greatly from their natural diet. And they depend on the gamekeepers here at the wildlife park to monitor their digestive health. And I'm sure you've noticed by now, oh, the female is coming over too. She's coming over right behind the male. So you can see her also. She's older than he is. She's about 11 years old and he's 8 or 9 years old. So she's a little bit older than he is. And I'm sure you've seen his antlers. So they are one of the more iconic characteristics of moose also, is that they have these big antlers. And the bull moose have those antlers. I'm going to stand over here so we can see both of them. And the bull moose have those antlers. Antlers are a cool feature of the deer family. Bull moose, they grow and shed these antlers each year for the breeding season. And that breeding season is called the rut. And they use those antlers to show their dominance. And it protects their eyes and their face when they're sparring. So when they're fighting other males and their antlers are hitting together, it helps protect their eyes and their faces. And they'll actually even rub urine on their antlers, and that scent entices the cows during the breeding season. So why do they not keep these antlers all year? Why do they shed them and regrow them? I have a bear moose antler here. As you can see, it's very big. It's also very heavy. These are solid bone. The female's very interested in me holding this antler here right now. So they're solid bone. They're very, very heavy. This one that I'm holding right now weighs about 15 pounds. And it's actually lighter now than it is when it's attached to their heads. When it's attached to them, it has a lot more moisture in it, making it a lot heavier. And when they fall off, when they shed these antlers, they lose a lot of that moisture. So it's lighter when it falls off, but it's still over 15 pounds. I also have a white-tailed deer antler here. So you can see they're very, very similar, except for, of course, the size. So they're still solid bone. We can look here in the end of it. It's not hollow, it's solid. So different than a horn, antlers are solid bone and they grow them and they shed them during different seasons. But horns are a lighter weight. They're actually made of a different thing, not bone, they're made of keratin, so it's a lot lighter, and they stay on their heads. Animals with horns don't lose those horns like animals with antlers do. And those antlers grow every spring, and then they shed them off after the breeding season in the early winter. And they have very strong neck muscles for holding their heads up and carrying these antlers. But again, they're made of solid bone, so they're very heavy. And antlers are one of the fastest growing tissues of any animal. If you watched our previous video, the Magnificent Moose video from a couple weeks ago, you can actually compare the size of Byron's antlers from that video to now and see that they've actually grown quite a bit in just a couple of weeks. They also require a lot of food to grow those antlers and to grow their giant body size and maintain their size. They are herbivores, so moose only eat plants. They eat the twigs and leaves from trees, and this is called browse. So they don't graze on grass. Some deer eat grass and things like that also, but moose just eat browse. They just eat those parts of trees. See over here. He's coming right up close to say hi. He is not shy at all. He is very, very friendly. And that's another reason that these animals are here. It would be very dangerous for a moose to be this friendly with people in the wild. We'll talk later about some of the threats that moose face, but of course, if you live in Maine, you probably have heard that some vehicle incidences and like vehicle collisions will happen. So when you look at his really long legs and his super big body, you can see how that would be really bad for a car to come into contact with one of these moose. And with him being so friendly, he would just come right up to the road to say hi to people, which would be really dangerous. So we talked about their food. So moose are ruminants. This means that they can digest the cellulose from plants. And plant cellulose is a very, very tough food to digest. So they have a special digestion. They have ruminant digestion. And this means that they can break down that very tough plant material. And they do this with the help of microorganisms. They have bacteria that live in their guts that help break down that cellulose. And this kind of digestion can also produce a lot of gas. So no offense to Byron, but he's very gassy. They do that regurgitating and chewing of their cud, kind of like cows do. So it's a little bit strange. It's a little bit weird type of digestion, but it's very complex. And it makes it so they can actually get a lot of nutrients from a pretty nutrient poor food source. Well, look at this jaw here as I'm talking about their diet. This is one of the first steps in that important and complex ruminant digestion is getting that food to their mouth and breaking down that food from the beginning. So they have these flat back teeth, and those are for grinding up plants. So these are those molars, and they're flat. And their incisors in the front are for plucking and grabbing branches. So these are their front incisors, and these are their back molars. And then they have this space in the middle here, and this is called the diastema. So they have no teeth in this space. It's called the diastema, and that separates their front incisors from their back teeth. So these are their grinding teeth, and these are their teeth for plucking and grabbing browse. And we here at the park cut tons, and I mean literally tons of browse for the moose here every year. And unlike their wild moose relatives, we also supplement their diet with some grain. So they will eat more than 2 pallets. So those big wooden pallets stacked high with grain. 2 of those pallets will feed these 2 adult moose for about 2 months. So they go through a lot of grain and they need a lot of food. We also give them probiotics, and that helps support their ruminant digestion. It's hard. I don't really know where to stand so we can see both of them, but I'll try not to block both of them. And one of the biggest reasons you don't see moose at a lot of other animal care facilities is because they do require so much food and they need to constantly have their digestive health monitored. So it's a lot of work and a lot of money and time that goes into caring for these super large deer. And even though they're so large, they're actually kind of tricky to find in the wild. They have a few different adaptations that make them a little bit tricky to find. So moose are most active during dusk and dawn. So especially during the hot months, these animals really do not like the heat. So they want to be active when it's least sunny and least hot out. They are covered in very thick brown fur. So you can see that the cow behind me, her fur is kind of shedding a little bit right now. So she's getting more of her summer coat. But I have up here a little bit closer too. You can see this hair a little bit closer up. You can see it's very thick. It's kind of wiry, a little bit coarse. And this helps them blend into their surrounding habitat. So especially when they're in the trees and they're in the woods, this is going to help them blend in a lot there. It also keeps them warm. I can show you this clump of hair here. And we can see those hairs up close. There's some in there that are small, like fluffy down hair, and that's going to help insulate them. And then these longer, coarse hairs. And they actually have a special adaptation where some of their hairs are hollow. And those hollow hairs trap air close to their bodies. So it traps warm air right in their hairs, and it helps insulate and keep them warm in the winter too. And they shed a lot for those warmer months, but they still have pretty thick hair. So when it's really hot and sunny here at the park, they find a shaded spot. We also have a sprinkler system for them. So they have a sprinkler that they can cool off in also. But they like to be in the shade or even like a muddy spot that helps cool their bodies. And also moose, I said, have those very long legs. So they use these long legs for trudging through the snow, and they also wade into the water. They like to eat some aquatic plants. So they'll wade out into the water and they'll have their tops of their bodies and their heads out of the water, and they can use their long legs so they can still get to those aquatic plants. And it's very tough to see them in the woods. Again, they have their camouflage and they have those very, very long legs. So they kind of look like the trees out in the woods. But if you are on the water, or you can see one of these moose in the water, it's a little bit easier to see them because they blend in less there than they do when they're in the woods. So along the water is a good spot to try and spot these moose. And we also find them in different areas during different seasons. The bulls tend to go to higher elevation when the temperatures are cooler. So the cows will stay at a lower elevation. Even though it's hotter, there's a lot more softwoods. So this means that there's more food for them while they have their calves. And they want to be able to get as much food as possible, as easily as possible, so that they can spend more time watching their vulnerable calves. Adult moose don't really have any natural predators. Adults are very difficult to kill. They're very large, but the young calves and those newborns will fall prey to different animals like coyotes or bears sometimes. So the moms are keeping a very watchful eye on them. Moose face some other threats, though. I mentioned earlier vehicle collisions. So also both legal and illegal harvest, disease, starvation, sometimes even accidental death. They'll actually fall down or trip, and if they fall from like a height, that can kill them, or sometimes even drowning. So sometimes we find moose that have died from accidental causes. Climate change is also affecting the moose. So as the warmer climates, that means that there are disease and parasites that can expand their range. So this is affecting moose more aggressively. The winter tick is a threat to the moose, especially. It can cause significant blood loss and makes them very, very sick, and it can lead to death. If you want to learn more about winter tick, you can go to mefishwildlife.com/winter tick. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about how the winter ticks are affecting our moose population, and just stuff about the winter ticks in general. So how can you help moose, and what can you do or not do if you see one? So safe driving is really important. So due to their height, again, they can be between 6 and 7 feet tall. Their eyes are higher on their head than like other deer or other animals. So our headlights actually don't catch their eyes, and it doesn't reflect back to us. So we don't see that eye shine. That's often a warning that there's an animal in the road. So we don't see that. And they also have very dark bodies. So they're very hard to see at night. And again, they're most active at dusk and dawn when there's lower light also. So we want to be really careful. Use your high beams when it's dark, especially on winding roads and in areas where there's a dense moose population. You can avoid driving at night, especially during those peak collision times of year and in certain habitats and regions. And of course, just slowing down and following the speed limits can help a lot. Another thing we can do to help moose is practice safe viewing. A lot of people really want to see these animals, but we need to respect their space. Especially during that breeding season, the bulls are extremely hormonal, and they will charge, they can kick. So we want to give them their space and really respect their habitat. Cows can also be really protective of their calves. So in certain times of season, when the cows have their calves with them, we want to be especially careful then. And just stay in your vehicles and watch from your vehicles. Again, keep a safe distance, and don't heckle or harass moose because they can charge pretty quickly, and they're really large and very powerful. So you definitely wouldn't want to kick from them to yourself or to your vehicle. So I'd love to answer any questions that have come in about moose. Our cow here can hang out and help me answer some questions.
So we did have a question about having the male and the female moose there. How do you keep them from reproducing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they can only reproduce during that breeding season. We don't have to worry about them trying to reproduce any other time of the season. Our female is on some medications that make it so that if he did try to reproduce with her, she would not have a baby. And we don't do any breeding here at the wildlife park. So we do everything we can to prevent any of the animals here from breeding. During the breeding season, we do separate them. So we have essentially 4 separate areas that we can split our moose into. So at this time of season, at this time of the year, they move freely between all the spaces and get along really well together. But when the breeding season starts, when that rut starts, we have to be more careful and we have to keep a compartment between them. So we'll have one that's empty and then we'll have them split on the other 2. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And on that same note, how many calves do moose typically have and how long do they stay with their mother?
Yeah, so it used to be more common for cows, at least in Maine, to sometimes have twins, but that's become less common. They'll usually just have 1 calf now, but they can have 2 calves. I think there's probably even been cases where they've had 3, but most of the time they're just going to have 1 or sometimes 2. And that is just once a year. So their breeding season is in the fall, and then they'll have their calves with them usually for their first year. And then the mother will kind of chase them off or they'll go off on their own after that first year.
Excellent. And someone was wondering if you had ever heard if it is true that moose are afraid of white objects.
I have never heard that. I really don't know. I'm sure that something like in nature would not normally be like white. Most things in nature are kind of those like browns and greens. So that might be startling to them for something like that. But I've never heard of that before. I'm not sure.
And someone was wondering, what are the natural enemies of the moose? You were saying some of the dangers they face, so what are some of their natural enemies?
Yeah, so adult moose don't really have any natural enemies other than, I guess, people. So their enemies, and that's not necessarily a natural enemy, but are vehicles and different moose harvesting, things like that. Um, the biggest natural enemy for adult moose right now is going to be parasites and disease. So those things are always battling back and forth with them trying to adapt to fend off those different diseases and parasites. But those diseases and parasites are also evolving and changing to stay on these moose as long as possible for their survival. So those diseases and parasites are the adult moose biggest natural threat. But the calves and the newborns, when they're smaller, again, when they're born, they're only about 25 pounds. And for a while, they'll probably only be between 25 and 100 pounds, so a lot smaller. They're going to be a little bit more vulnerable to animals like coyotes or sometimes even bears.
And someone was wondering, how do they do when they are brought back together after after they were separated?
They do really well. I said earlier that Annie is a little bit older, so the female is a little bit older than the male is. So she has a little bit more dominance over him a lot of the time. She's been known to kind of put him in his place and she'll give him a good kick if he's being annoying. But they do have very different personalities from each other and they get along pretty well. You can see right now, she's kind of pinning her ears back at him because she doesn't even want him over here at the food with her. So she does really good at holding her own. She's actually even a little bit taller than he is right now because she's a few years older. But as you can see, he's also getting that rack. So that is going to make him look a lot bigger and more dominant over her. So they have very different personalities, but they've always gotten along really well. And we've had no trouble with these two. In fact, all of the moose that I've known that we've had here at the park have gotten along really well. We just have to be really careful whenever we're introducing new moose to make that a really positive experience for all of them. So they kind of get off on the right foot and have the best first impressions that they can.
And someone was wondering, when will he start to rub off that velvet that's covering his antlers?
Yeah, so as it gets closer to the breeding season, so once we get into mid-fall, usually it's around like October time, like around like October, maybe end of September, early November, is when that rut really kicks in. So he'll have kind of a surge of hormones. His testosterone will spike, and that starts to trigger that velvet to start falling off. And then he'll also rub it off on the trees. And then what will be left behind is that bare bone that's underneath the velvet. So again, that happens anytime between like the end of September to the beginning of November.
And how long do they live in the wild?
That can vary quite a bit. That winter tick is especially harmful to young moose. So if they can survive their first few years without getting infested with those winter ticks, then they do a really great job and can live a long time if they can reach that kind of adult age where they're less vulnerable. I said the female here at the park, she's 11 years old and living to be between kind of 10 and 12 years old has been pretty typical in captivity. And in the wild, they can live into their teens. So they can live a pretty long time.
That's great. And I put it in the comments, but I just want to remind people that a few weeks ago, our moose biologist did a video talk as well about some things with the populations with our wild moose. So please check that out if you have more questions in relationship to the winter ticks and moose population status. But that seems to be all of our questions for today.
Yeah, and of course, other questions too, you can go to mefishwildlife.com. Find a lot of other interesting things about our moose population here in Maine, different moose management, and you can find that video that our moose biologist did about moose management also. I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in today and listening about Maine's moose. I love talking about our moose here at the park, and I'm very thankful that both of them came over to say hi. So thank you all again, and big thank you to our moose at the park for being superstars today. Bye, thank you.